What is happening, everybody? James Hancock here. Thanks for joining us for today's Godzilla live stream Rampage, where Martin Kessler and I will be discussing the past, the present, and the future of the king of the monsters, Godzilla. We've got a few specific topics we prepared to discuss, but feel free to chime in with comments or questions anytime. And the good news is, I know a hell of a lot less about Godzilla than Martin, so all the hard questions he will do, and I get to hit all the softballs. But we have a ton to get to, so let's just dive right in. In an era where so many classic franchises are in really rough shape, it feels like Godzilla, even though he's 70 years old, might be more popular than ever. And obviously, Godzilla Minus One, it's one of the most popular, beloved Godzilla movies ever made. And we've got Godzilla Kong, not Godzilla X Kong, just Godzilla Kong, the new empire coming out in a few days. But I've only been a casual fan off and on throughout my life, and only recently started watching a lot of the classics. So my perspective's a little warped. It seems like right now we're in the middle of like Godzilla fever. But for you, Mr. Kessler, can you remember a better time to be a fan of Godzilla at any time in your life?
I think this really might be the best time to be a Godzilla fan. I think, especially with what Toho's been doing in this most recent era, you hear people talk about Shin Godzilla and Godzilla Minus One with being on par with the original. Like they're fantastic. And I think I've definitely lived through periods where there's been a high amount of hype for Godzilla. And you can see that there are these recurring patterns where, a Godzilla movie comes out, it's really good. More of them start to come out. You start getting diminishing returns. It gets a little bit crazier and crazier. And then Godzilla has to go away for a while. And you rebuild anticipation and it comes back. And there's new excitement, new fans, renewed energy for Godzilla. So I don't know if we're at quite at that point yet, but usually when there's a lot of Godzilla, it's a sign that Godzilla might make another disappearing act. But I think it's
But we kind of have the best of both worlds right now. If what
Yes.
you want is good old-fashioned, authentic Japanese Godzilla, well, the last two Japanese Godzilla films were very satisfying. If anything, some of the best Godzilla movies ever made.
Yeah.
Or if what you want is the big budget, legendary, Hollywood experience, well, then you've got a ton of those as well. So it's almost like this giant buffet is out there right now. All we need is like a kick-ass Godzilla video game made by From Software, maybe like a cool animated series, and then like the entire like kind of array of entertainment options would be at our fingertips.
That Godzilla PlayStation game, it goes for a lot of money. It's like $80 I see it going for on eBay. That one's pretty sought after.
Yeah, I would love to have a game where you start off as a creature and you're slowly but surely mutating and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Like you start out just fighting like a town or a boat or whatever, but then over time you start to take on cities and or other giant creatures. It would be really, really fun. So if anybody wants to steal that idea, I give you permission.
What's that video game with the shark where you're just eating things and growing?
Absolutely.
Godzilla, that'd be pretty cool. I could get behind that.
Well, the main goal today is to do a little compare and contrast between the last three Godzilla movies made in Japan versus the last three Godzilla movies made by Legendary for their Monsterverse. But before we get to this potentially epic battle, and I know people in the chat are probably going to have some strong opinions, and we welcome strong opinions. When you've got 35 live action movies and 3 animated movies, not everybody's going to agree on which are the good ones, which are the bad ones. But Martin's going to ease us into the pool with a few basics about the glory days of the character during the Showa era. And for any diehard fans, we know most of this will be review, but never forget that somebody out there who's 18, 19, who's excited for Godzilla Kong, the New Empire, maybe they've never seen any of the classic Godzilla films and they're looking for a little guidance on where to start. So Mr. Kessler, the floor is yours.
All right. Going back to the original film in 1954, groundbreaking, obviously drawing on films that had already been released, like King Kong was a big influence, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms was a big influence. But I think what everyone brought on that film, the seriousness that they took the subject matter with, the seriousness of the themes, I think really elevated it into being the best giant atomic monster movie of the 1950s and maybe ever. I think when your competition, it's like giant tarantulas and stuff like that. It's Godzilla's an obvious standout. So that film, I think the reputation of the Showa era, eventually it becomes like a little bit sillier, but you look at the original Godzilla film and it's still intense. A lot of it's still terrifying, heart-wrenching. I mean,
beautifully atmospheric in its photographic style.
yeah, I mean, Ishiro Honda, who directed it, he was Godzilla. He was Akira Kurosawa's second unit director. He was his
And
go-to guy.
happy birthday to Akira Kurosawa
Happy
today.
birthday to Akira Kurosawa.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you do see a lot of crossover with some of the talent. Like you look at the original film, you've got Takashi Shimura playing the doctor in it. You know, it's like a little bit of a cousin to the Akira Kurosawa films just because of some of the talent involved. And you see like a very high caliber of talent going into it. Also, I mean, the score in the original one blows me away every time. I
It's
love when
still
they
blowing
bring it
people
back.
away. In
Yeah,
2023, watching Godzilla Minus One, and I
yeah,
went into the movie totally exhausted, like, oh my God, how am I ever going to make it through it? And then when the score kicked in for the final battle scene, I was like swinging in my chair and stomping my feet. I mean, the score fucking, it slaps, as they say,
yeah.
the kids these days.
Ifukube scores. I mean, he did a bunch of them throughout the Showa era. Like they were incredible. I love the scores. Like I was listening to the score for King Kong versus Godzilla the other day. It just gets me pumped. Like I love listening to his scores and like the special effects by Eiji Tsuburaya. I know at the time he wanted to do it all with stop motion animation because his big inspiration was King Kong, which is all stop motion animation. But they're
And
like, we don't really have the time or the money to do all of that.
Harryhausen film, that was the most obvious influence.
Yeah,
That was all stop motion, and it's gorgeous, but stop motion is time consuming and
yeah.
expensive.
So the suit animation kind of came out as a compromise to, hey, we can't afford to do all this stop motion animation. But that became the standard for these tokusatsu movies. You know, it's a whole style doing the suit animation, and it's eventually disappeared. Computer animation eventually displaced it, but you have a good long run of these
Well, what is the last Godzilla movie with somebody in a suit?
Godzilla Final Wars. If you don't count
Gotcha.
the short movies, they do these like anniversary short films, which have some suit animation. But I think like the last
So basically, for
last
50
official
years, you had
release,
people in suits.
yeah, for 50 years you had people in suits. You know, like the Millennium era we're going to talk about in a little bit. That was kind of the last hurrah, I think, for the suit animation, and you can already see a lot of CGI in some of those movies, like Godzilla Final Wars. There's a lot of CGI. Some of it's used for great comedic effect, but I think we'll probably get into that in a little bit. So
Totally.
Godzilla was a big hit. There was an American release, Godzilla King of the Monsters, with Raymond Burr, where they kind of edited out some of the more disturbing stuff and put in a journalist character, Canadian actor Raymond Burr, to kind of ease in American audiences, and that helped.
They were still doing the same thing in 1985. My first
Well,
Godzilla movie was Godzilla 1985, but that was an Americanized, like, recutting
yeah.
of The Return of
I mean,
Godzilla from
what's great is they
1984.
brought back Raymond Burr for that. And originally
Yeah.
for Godzilla 1985, by that point, the reputation of the Godzilla films was kind of like they were campy, kitschy in America. So they were going to make Godzilla 1985 a comedy. They were going to make the American release of it. I guess the Japanese one, it's called like Return to Godzilla or something like that. But for the Godzilla 1985 release, the initial plan was, hey, we're going to make fun of this movie. We're going to have the dubbing be a joke. We're going to have everything turn it into a comedy. And when they brought on Raymond Burr, who was there for the original, he's like, no, you have to take this seriously. Like, this is like deathly serious. And I think like that's kind of the thing that helped the original launch this whole franchise, and that's kind of what helped with Godzilla 1985 being a comeback film, is it takes it super serious.
Anytime they take it serious, it kind of gives it like an additional extension on life. But it's funny, when I saw Godzilla in 1985, I was a blank slate. I didn't have any preconceived notions apart from one impression. In 1979, when I was a toddler, my dad was already bringing home comics from the spinner rack at 7-Eleven, and my older brother was getting a little collection going. But when your collection is small, you end up just rereading the same comics over and over again. So here is, I made a little video of it, the cover to my first exposure to Godzilla ever. Bada bing. I mean, can you imagine what would happen today if Legendary and Disney teamed up and said, all right, all the surviving Avengers and Godzilla, they're going to fight?
Well,
I mean,
have you seen there's Godzilla versus Kong versus Justice League comics out right now?
I have not.
They're pretty cool. I got to say, like, King Kong gets a Green Lantern ring. They look like
Nice.
a lot of fun.
Or
So
maybe, I don't know.
I think maybe the spirit of that is still going on. Oh, I see a comment from FC Schaefer. Anyone remember Attack of the Mushroom People? Well, it's sort of funny. Like the Showa era, we're mostly talking about Godzilla films, but like there were a lot of other giant monster movies, and
Tons, yeah.
yeah, like
And they would
a lot
eventually
of them were
bleed
directed
in
by
and make
Hiroshige Honda.
crossovers. And
Yeah. Well, the first big crossover that kind of set the trend was King Kong versus Godzilla, where through like a complicated rights situation where you had the rights for a King Kong versus Frankenstein film bought up by Toho, and they're like, instead of Frankenstein, we should just have him fight one of our own monsters. And they picked Godzilla, and Godzilla hadn't really gotten that reputation as the hero yet. But if you look at the trend that followed for the rest of the Showa era, a lot of it's not following the original Godzilla. A lot of it's following King Kong versus Godzilla. Like that's kind of the template for the monster versus monster, the more child-oriented stuff, the sense of humor. Like a lot of it comes from King Kong versus Godzilla, which was a massive, massive hit. Like I think adjusted for inflation, it's still one of the most successful Godzilla or King Kong films. Like it's it was that successful at the time.
so I do have a clip prepared from this era. So, but before I play it, like, how would you try to persuade, say somebody has only been watching Godzilla movies since the 2014 film Ford. So they've seen some Japanese films, some American films, but how do you make the pitch for somebody who's been kind of conditioned for modern special effects to enjoy something like Destroy All Monsters from 1968?
I mean,
キングギドラ宇宙怪獣キングギドラです上空から地球の怪獣を狙っております
So if someone only knows the modern era, how do you like sell them on the idea? No, this is worth going back and watching, because Max, in their infinite wisdom, has the rights to a ton of these old Godzilla movies. I saw Ghidorah, the three-headed monster. I saw Godzilla versus Hedorah. Like there are a ton of them on that platform, just waiting to be rediscovered.
I mean, I think the best way to get into those is go back to the beginning and work through them chronologically. Like continuity is not a huge deal with the Showa movies, or really any of these Godzilla movies until maybe the 90s ones, but it's like wrestling continuity. So it's fun seeing like Ghidorah, the three-headed monster, introduced in one, and then coming back in Invasion of the Astro Monster, and then by the time you get to Destroy All Monsters, which was supposed to be the last one at the time, they threw in like everybody. King Kong was even supposed to have an appearance, but they couldn't work out the rights for it. Yeah, that run from King Kong versus Godzilla, Mothra versus Godzilla, Ghidorah, Invasion of the Astro Monster, Ibra, which was also supposed to be a King Kong film at first, and they swapped Godzilla into it. I think it's Son of Godzilla, then Destroy All Monsters was supposed to be the grand finale, but then they kind of renewed the series for children's matinee programming. And that run, it's a little bit lower budget. You can kind of start to see the diminishing returns when you have
What's
like,
hilarious is
All
that they
Monsters
thought
Attack.
Godzilla versus Hedorah was a more
Well-
like child-friendly movie, where it's like when you watch it now, it's like, this is so strange and
You know what?
otherworldly, and like long sequences of like monsters just kind of talking and waving. Like this is like watching the Wookiees in the Star Wars Christmas special. Like I need to know what these monsters are saying if they're going to talk for 10 minutes.
I mean, what's funny is Godzilla versus Hedorah, when it came out, it was considered like this like blight on the series. It was considered a huge failure. Yoshimitsu Banno was basically like banned from ever directing another Godzilla film by Toho at the time, because they thought it was so strange. Like they're like, you're going to ruin the franchise with this like psychedelic stuff. But now these days, Hedorah is one of the standouts of that era of Godzilla, because it is so unusual, and I love the psychedelic stuff, some of the animation, the kind of darker themes dealing with pollution, and you get some grim imagery kind of worked into this child-friendly movie, which is kind of surprising. And eventually, like Yoshimitsu Banno, he does come back into the story later on, because he was sort of instrumental in Legendary Pictures getting the rights to do a new American Godzilla. But like at the time, it was like, you can never make another Godzilla movie. I mean, when I first saw it, it was called Godzilla versus the Smog Monster.
Yeah, and that's how most people refer to it. It's a more dramatic title for Western audiences.
Yeah. But yeah, Godzilla versus Hedorah is one of the standouts. So, some of the later ones, like you can see, like they're really for kids, like Godzilla versus Megalon with Jet Jaguar, and I think that was actually the first one I ever watched as a little kid because I remember the weird boat sequence at the beginning, which was scary, and then the rest of the movie's a little bit boring. But I think like those films, they're easiest to get into when you're a kid. But I think as an adult, you can still kind of appreciate the charm and the humor, and it's a little bit like
Take
when
a
you go back and watch
fistful
like
of marijuana
Batman
edibles and lie back
or that might work.
and enjoy the show. Because that's what I did.
Yeah.
I mean, like, it's funny. My Godzilla journey was so kind of haphazard. I'd seen the original from 1954, and I'd been kind of following the American ones whenever they would come out from like 85 through like Roland Emmerich up through the Legendary era. But then after I saw Godzilla Minus One, I was like, I should go back and start watching some of the classics, some of the essentials. So I just looked up a bunch of lists, like which filmmakers, like when they mentioned which of the films are their favorites. And that's where I started. And if you're into film history and you're into the history of the kaiju genre, then I think they're well worth hunting down. But let's get into the topic at hand. So the reason we're doing this this podcast or this live stream in the first place, we're having a little discussion through DMs where we decided we wanted to compare and contrast the last 3 movies made in Japan with the last 3 movies made in America, which we're going to start with the end of the Millennium era in Japan.
I can speed run, catch people up to speed from the Showa era to.
All right, yeah, give us the cliff notes. What happened between Showa in the 70s and Millennium, which starts like in around like 99 or 2000? When does the Millennium era begin?
I'll explain. So like Showa era, I mean, in addition to Godzilla, you also had like other monster movies. I mean, you had Gamera over at Dai, which was like a knockoff, which I always think it's funny. You have to kind of qualify the Gamera films as like, the old ones are like ironically funnier than the Godzilla movies, but like the 90s Gamera movies are like actually better than the Godzilla movies. And like, no, it's good. It's better. But so you had a bunch of monster movies. Eventually the trend kind of burnt itself out. They had diminishing returns just from kind of cranking out a new one every couple months. Like I think sometimes the gap in between them wasn't even a full year. So eventually it kind of ran its course. Terror of Mechagodzilla was the last one of the original run, and that brought back Ishiro Honda. It was kind of the big finale, but it I don't think made really any money. So Toho was like, okay, we're going to put Godzilla on ice for a little while. We're going to stow him away. We're going to bring it back and kind of renew excitement. So that's when you get Godzilla 1985. Then I think it's Biollante, Godzilla versus King Ghidorah, where you have Mecha King Ghidorah. I thought
I've got a poster for it. Tony Stella picked this one out by
the poster
Noriyoshi Orai, if I'm saying that name at all correctly. Brilliant poster designer, and he's done great stuff for Star Wars, for Godzilla, for a variety of things. A lot of great erotic art as well. But I asked Tony Stella, who obviously knows his shit when it comes to posters, what are the good ones? And he sent me like 10 without any of the titles for the Noriyoshi posters. But this is the one that I went with.
The art's just incredible.
Yeah. So I mean, as good as any poster artist you're going to find from any era.
So those were the ones that were coming out while I was a kid. So those were like the new Godzilla movies. It was funny, like as a kid watching, Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla 2 and Godzilla versus Space Godzilla. I mean, I even thought when Legendary Pictures was teasing their Monsterverse after Godzilla King of the Monsters with King Ghidorah's skull, I'm like, oh, are they going to do Mecha King Ghidorah? Because that was the thing in the 90s. I'm like, that would be an interesting kind of deep cut. But there were talks for a long time about Hollywood doing a Godzilla film. Like you had, I know Fred Decker talked about doing it. Tim Burton, Jan de Bont got kind of close where they were going to have Godzilla versus this giant griffin monster, which would have been pretty cool. But eventually it went to Roland Emmerich. And because they knew the American Godzilla film was coming out, Toho was like, okay, we're going to wrap up the 90s series with Godzilla versus Destroyer. We're going to kill off Godzilla, let America have its run. So they kill off Godzilla with Godzilla.
And that one's well worth hunting down. That's one of the weird, obscure ones that I've seen. I think the first question was, what's your favorite obscure Godzilla? I think Godzilla versus Destroyer. If you want to see the deep cuts, that is one worth hunting down.
I mean, that one, since I was a kid, always like got to me emotionally because like, there's the scene where they kill Godzilla's son and Godzilla's going into like this nuclear meltdown, which again, like Legendary Pictures brings back for King of the Monsters with, I think, less of an emotional impact. But like, I get goosebumps whenever I watch Godzilla versus Destroyer when the girl like turns right into camera and she's like, I think this might be Godzilla's last fight. And it's, that all out Godzilla versus this crazy monster, grand finale to the 90s series. And like Godzilla dies, and that was kind of the end of Godzilla at the time. And you have the American Godzilla by Roland Emmerich. And
I saw the Chinese theater in LA. It was my second summer in Los Angeles as an intern, and all I'd seen was Godzilla 1985 and read that little comic from 1979. So I basically didn't know shit, but Independence Day had been successful.
Well,
so I went to see it, and the movie sucked ass.
Like I was a kid when that movie came out, and I walked into the theater being like, "Huh, that wasn't good." Like at the time, even being a little kid, when you kind of love everything,
something's off.
Love it just because Godzilla's in. I was like, movies are supposed to be good. That wasn't good.
It had a movie with the foot, and that was about it.
Yeah. So I think it made money, but a lot of people recognized that it was a disappointment for fans, and it probably could have made money if it stayed true to the spirit of Godzilla. I think like the quip from Toho that was kind of famous was, well, they took the god out of Godzilla. They made it just a big monster.
The wrathful, angry god.
Some like apologists try to say, well, it's more like a good American remake of The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. I don't know if that holds, but
there's some people who won't criticize any Godzilla movie because they love Godzilla that much, and more power to them. They're the ones who've been keeping the fire alive for 70 years. If that's the way they want to, if that's a tack they want to take. But as somebody who's seen most of Roland Emmerich's movies, Godzilla was the first big warning sign that his career was going to rapidly fly off the rails.
I think so. And I think like the Godzilla fan community is really positive. Like I think when people talk about like, oh, this fandom's toxic, that fandom's toxic, like in my experience, the Godzilla fandom is very positive, very supportive, very welcoming. And there's a little bit of this attitude of like, hey, there's a little bit of Godzilla for everyone. Like, if you like that, that's fine. We know like a lot of this is silly. Sometimes we like the silly ones, but I think most people would regard the American Godzilla as a artistic failure. And that made it all the way to Toho, who originally they were going to keep Godzilla on ice until 2005. They were going to like hold him off for another decade to like rebuild anticipation. But they're like, oh, this American Godzilla has kind of tarnished our brand so much. We need to bring Godzilla back now. Like we need to
damage control.
We need to do damage control. So that leads to Godzilla 2000. And I think the Millennium era, it's kind of weird because a lot of it feels like throwing things at the wall and hoping something's going to stick, and nothing quite sticks.
Like here's a little Matrix, here's a little Godzilla. You can see a lot of stylistic influences. And the only film from the Millennium era that I know, like from start to finish, is Final Wars. And I don't know if that is emblematic of the rest of the Millennium era, but it definitely strikes a very specific tone.
It's so all over the place. Like I think, like talking about continuity with some of these, like the biggest continuity with the Showa era, with the Heisei era, is tonal continuity. Like they are consistent in that way. The tone of the Millennium era, which like even the fact that they call it the Millennium era, like all the Godzilla eras except for Millennium are named after like the Imperial era. So like Showa's for the Showa Emperor, Heisei's for the, like it's the different Imperial eras. Now we're on, I think it's called Reiwa. But Millennium is just kind of like, like we cranked out a bunch of Godzilla films, and it feels like a weird time period for Godzilla, and nothing really quite landing.
Let's call it Godzilla Y2K.
Legit great films that came out of that. Like I think most people regard GMK, Giant Monsters All Out Attack, as being one of the best Godzilla films.
I tried watching it last night, but I could only find the English dub, which was driving me crazy. And I looked far and wide, but everybody keeps mentioning that one as one of the essential.
Yeah, I would say that one's essential, and that one's directed by Shusuke Kaneko, who did the 90s Gamera trilogy, which I think if you're comparing the 90s Heisei Godzilla to like 90s Gamera takes it every time. Like the Gamera movies.
You sent me a Gamera clip. Do you want me to?
Yeah,
what does that Gamera clip come from?
I think that's from Gamera versus Iris.
All right, here we go.
Series.
Yeah, I was
It,
having
it
a
just
little battle with
looks great.
YouTube with some of the clips beforehand, but we do have a
Yeah,
decent number of clips from the flicks. But some of the obvious ones, like King Kong versus Godzilla from
yeah.
1963, YouTube was like, "Nope, you don't get to play with that." Anyway, I kept getting shot down, but we have some stranger, more obscure clips to share as we
Well,
go.
like the storytelling in those Gamera movies is just better. The visual effects are just better. Like the scale, everything looks fantastic, and it's not a coincidence that you have like Shinji Higuchi being the visual effects director on those Gamera movies, going on to co-direct Shin Godzilla. So like I think a lot of people who look back on that era kind of say, like, yeah, we like the Heisei Godzilla films, but like really the Gamera movies were the gold standard of that period. So you see some of the talent come back later, like directing GMK or co-directing Shin Godzilla. So like I think, you know, if you want the essential kaiju movie experience from the 90s, you got to go with Gamera over Godzilla. I'm
Gotcha.
sorry, you just do. But GMK's, I think a lot of people consider that one to be the best of the Millennium era. I agree with that. I think it's just an interesting story, but like there's not really any connective tissue between any of the Millennium films except for Godzilla against Mechagodzilla and Tokyo SOS. Those two kind of dovetail into
All right.
each
So,
other.
question then: Godzilla Final Wars begins with a battle where they basically confine him to like the core of the planet and get him
Yeah.
out of. Is that the ending of the previous movie, or they just make it
No,
up?
it's just making it up as they
I
go.
love it. That makes me
Yeah,
like
like
Godzilla Final Wars even more.
yeah. Well, so the Millennium era, none of these movies quite stuck. I think yeah, GMK is genuinely great, but like I think none of them were making a lot of money. None of them were really like taking off with audiences. Um, so they were like, okay, we're gonna retire Godzilla again. You know, like a year earlier before they planned to even bring him back, just because this run was kind of a response to the American Godzilla, and like a lot of Godzilla is sort of responding to what came before, you know, and that's how you get these trends where it's like Godzilla goes from more serious to more comedic or more silly, and then back to being more serious. It kind of sees this pendulum swinging back and forth. But Godzilla Final Wars, that's the last of the Millennium era, and that was the last that everyone had seen of Godzilla for quite a while. But I,
Well,
I
allow
think,
me to make a pitch for
all
Godzilla
right,
Final Wars. If you like folks in rubber suits, they're there, as I just learned at the beginning of this podcast, and that's the last one. But for me, as someone who likes MMA, having Gary Goodridge and Don the Predator Fry. Gary Goodridge is a small role, but for people who are watching UFC and Pride in the late 90s, these would be very familiar faces, and they would fight in America, and then they'd fly over to Japan, where they would fight for a lot more money under Pride. And with Pride, they had this special rule where we not only are not going to test you for performance enhancing drugs, we encourage you to take performance enhancing drugs. And so you get these giant, muscular, huge. I mean, it's almost like a kaiju movie watching some of those Pride fights. And one of the great like luminaries from that era is Don Fry, who has this incredible voice, incredible mustache, and he had this legendary brawl that started with basically 2 or 3 minutes of nothing but just basically like roundhouses to the face as both of them are holding each other behind the neck. It's just total brutality. And I have to say, Don does a pretty damn good job
you know,
in the part that was given to him.
for somebody who's clearly not a polished actor,
At all. He's a non-actor.
He's a non-actor. He's very charismatic. I feel like Godzilla Final Wars should have been like not a star-making role, but like a B-star making role. You know, he should have been in a bunch of movies with like Bruce Campbell, or you know, he should have been in a lot of those types of films. Because
a lot of retiring MMA fighters do drift over to the world of B films, like B action movies. But I think it's so cool that he's drifting over to the world of B kaiju movies, as opposed to like traditional, like, you know, Undisputed Part 4, the final knockdown, blah, like, you know, all these kind of, you know, routine, interchangeable B action movies.
Apparently they went through like a big long list of actors that they asked to play that role before they eventually got to somebody who would say yes, before they eventually got to Don Fry.
Well, you were kind of
like
Don clip, so
Johnson
here's a
and-
little taste of the Predator in Godzilla Final Wars.
女を殴んの
Yeah. Sorry, sweetheart.
And that's how he talks. If you watch him in interviews, you don't like Don the Predator Fry. And that's how he spoke with all of his intros with the UFC back when he was the I guess he was UFC champ around like UFC 6 or 7. UFC 300's coming up, but he was back in the early days when they were in the single digits. But I thought he was a fucking delight throughout this entire, and watching him basically in Captain Kirk mode in a fucking spaceship flying around battling monsters, it was delightful.
It's, I really like Godzilla Final Wars for a movie that's doesn't really have the best reputation with fans because it's so crazy, it's so overstuffed, and it was meant to be this big like extravaganza celebration of decades of Godzilla. It was kind of the 50th anniversary movie for Godzilla. I really like it. The director Kitamura, it's the same guy who did Versus. I don't know if you've seen that, but it's kind of like cool action, low budget movie that he made. But he went on to do other things, like he directed Midnight Meat Train, which I love. That's I think one of the best Clive Barker adaptations. So he's had a really interesting career, but like the Godzilla thing, I think he knocked it out of the park as far as like all the silly aspects and the Showa.
Was he the first to bring in mutants where people on the ground were able to fight kaiju without, giant machines and that sort of thing? Because
like
basically have
robots,
superheroes fighting kaiju.
Like there's like a little bit of that in some of the other Godzilla movies, but like what's funny to me is I read an interview with him. He was like, the old like 60s, 70s Godzilla movies are great, but everything else is just garbage. Like that's the stuff that he really loves are the Godzilla films that are kind of silly and have aliens and have all these weird things in it. So like I think his celebration of Godzilla, it's of a particular kind of Godzilla, and if you like that kind of sillier side of Godzilla, you're gonna love Final Wars. But
like if you enjoy it when a Godzilla movie gets interrupted for like an elaborate musical number, like when I watched Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster like just a couple weeks ago, there's a moment where the two girls, what's it called, like Infant Island or Baby Island or whatever, there's two little miniature girls, they're singing a song and we get like this crazy montage. I was like, what is going on? I was like, I love it, but this is unexpected if all you've seen is legendary monster movies.
They were hoping like some of these songs were going to catch on as hits. Like I was just watching Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla, the original one, and like there's a lengthy scene where she's just like singing for King Caesar to come out, and I'm like, this song kind of sucks. But there's a lot of singing in these movies. But so Final Wars, it's very silly, it's very over the top, it's very jam packed, and it didn't really make a lot of money. So like Toho's basically saying, okay, we're going to put Godzilla on ice, maybe indefinitely this time. Like they weren't really sure when Godzilla was going to come back or if he was going to come back at all, because the Millennium era wasn't making a lot of money. I think, it was so all over the place, and it was also kind of at an awkward time in the history of special effects where it's the very end of that suit animation.
Yeah. And the tidal wave of CGI has arrived.
CGI. So you can see like some CGI in Godzilla Final Wars. I don't know if you want to show the clip where he wrecks the American Godzilla.
Oh, Byzilla? Hang on, here it is. I mean, that music choice, if you want to feel like it's 2004 in seconds, just watch Godzilla Final Wars. Music cues date your movie so quickly.
Might be one of the most early 2000s films ever made. Like it's just got that like kind of crazy energy and the way it uses the visual effects and the way that like the ambition clearly outstrips the budget, where they're going to do this crazy globe spanning,
I prefer that though to the budget outstripping the ambition, which is so often the case with a lot of Hollywood movies.
We might get into next.
Yeah, they have $300 million at their fingertips, but not an ounce of creativity. What I would prefer is to see a movie with a considerably smaller budget, but just overflowing, busting at the seams with creativity. I feel like that's why people keep going back and watching this 70-year-old franchise, is that the creativity always exceeds the resources at their disposal.
And it's just such a fun moment seeing the original Godzilla obliterate the Roland Emmerich CGI version that nobody likes.
It's in the opera house. Like, sorry,
it's not even like an intense fight. It's just Godzilla curb stomps him. You know, I
Yeah,
mean,
he's
this is
putting
like
out a cigarette on his forehead.
Final Wars. It's kind of like Godzilla's Infinity War, where he's Thanos and he's just destroying monster after monster after monster. Like they're Thanos curb stomping superheroes. So it.
All right. Well,
It's
then
great.
set the stage for us then. How does Legendary enter the picture? Because I think a lot of people, their first Godzilla movies ever have been his appearances in Legendary's Monsterverse. So how did this get up and running?
I guess everyone was kind of looking for a shared universe after the success of the Marvel franchise. They wanted to copy that formula, and what the Godzilla films did during the Showa era basically was a template that you could copy. So Yoshimitsu Banno, who did Godzilla vs. Hedorah, wanted to come back and make a Godzilla short movie, like a 40-minute IMAX 3D kind of movie. So he got the rights to make that, and he was sort of shopping them around. And I guess eventually he hooked up with Legendary Pictures, who didn't want to make that, but they're like, oh, we can get the rights to Godzilla. And that's what eventually leads to the Gareth Edwards Godzilla film. Meanwhile, at the same time, you had the Peter Jackson King Kong, where they were trying to make a prequel to that. And that was going to be, that's what eventually turned into Kong Skull Island.
Gotcha.
Studios, and I mean, it's kind of fun. The original director that Peter Jackson picked to do Kong Skull Island was Adam Wingard, who didn't direct that, but he ends up directing Godzilla vs. Kong. So, you know, between those two, you get the rights to King Kong, you get the rights to Godzilla. Hey, we can make a Monsterverse, which is, I guess, what they decided to do. And it's kind of funny, like now that Marvel's kind of stumbling, I was sort of thinking, like, I don't know, financially, it's probably the DC films, but I feel like maybe in terms of consistency, the Monsterverse movies are probably the most successful attempt to crib that Marvel formula. You know, I think
True. Yeah. I mean, a lot of people have tried to do the shared universe approach. I'm like, just do sequels. You don't have to do a shared universe. Like, I mean, I feel like, anyway, I don't want to get derailed talking about Marvel, but we were just talking before we started recording about this new loathsome term of franchise extension. And I heard this phrase coined by Matthew Bellany on his podcast, The Town. And he was using it to describe Ghostbusters Frozen Empire, where because you have the rights to something, you have to continue cranking stuff out, even if you don't want to, because your investors expect you to. But Godzilla might be one of the better examples of that loathsome term, franchise extension. You just got to keep going one way or another. It just keeps reinventing itself for a new era.
I suppose so. I mean, I think one of the things I could say about Toho that's smart is their ability to, when they see the trend is waning, to pull back and say, okay, like we've gone too far.
The music stopped. Let's go home for a little while.
Yep.
And then when the music starts up again, we'll come back.
You know, when the milk starts going a little bit dry, like, okay, we're not going to milk this cow to death. You know, I think they've been kind of careful with that, and especially in this most recent era, they've been, I think, very selective with the projects that they've chosen, which and
what I feel like with these what happens with a lot of franchises now, I don't know if people are following Shogun or not, but whether you're talking about the miniseries or the new version, there's a scene in episode 5 where Blackthorn's got this pheasant hanging, and he wants to basically let it rot and dry for a week before he eats it, and everybody's totally revolted. That's what most franchises feel like these days, where it's like this rotten pheasant with flies all over it. Somebody claims they have a use for it, but then you find out when somebody gets killed over it that he never cared about it in the first place, which is how I feel about Disney. Like, they never really cared about the first place, but they just got to keep making these fucking Marvel movies and that sort of thing. But every once in a while with Godzilla, whether it's Shin Godzilla or Godzilla -1, somebody comes along where you can tell they love Godzilla. They got it in their bones and their DNA, and that's what it takes to keep things going.
Yeah. I mean, the American 2014 Godzilla, although Legendary Pictures, I think they're owned by like a Chinese conglomerate, so it might actually be like secretly the Chinese.
Well, I think they own like 49% or something. They definitely have heavy Chinese investment, which is why you saw so many of their films getting wide releases in China.
Well, it's also why like some of their films, like Kong Skull Island, it's like here's a Chinese character who doesn't do anything, but she's in the movie. Like there's a couple of those.
Zhang Ziyi,
Well, Zhang Ziyi, she has like.
She's there basically just to say that's King Ghidorah. It's like, oh, thank you for
the monsters.
You know, for being the exposition queen throughout this movie.
Well, let's get into the Monsterverse.
Yeah. All right. So 2014, I would say I'm indifferent to the legendary movies. My
Yeah.
favorite of their monster movies has been Godzilla, Kong Skull Island, but that is not on the agenda today because there's no
No,
Godzilla
there's not a
in it.
single, which I completely agree. I think far and away that's my favorite of the Monsterverse movies. I think they hit just the right tone where it's a little bit adult with the violence. It's got this great sense of humor where you have people sacrificing themselves in vain and blowing up, and
And gorgeous imagery, like
and it
close-ups of
looks
King
great.
Kong's
Like,
eyes. Yeah.
visually, I think like it looks fantastic, but that's not what we're here to talk about. I think the Gareth Edwards one, what I can appreciate about the Gareth Edwards Godzilla is, I think compared to the Roland Emmerich one, they do kind of put the god back in Godzilla. He's enormous. He's this sort of mysterious being. I think for me, where it kind of fails is in the story. I think you lose any kind of emotional attachment after Bryan Cranston's character dies.
Yeah.
And like I
And I
think
love how the trailer was
Yeah.
all Bryan Cranston doing, his shtick, which is a very enjoyable shtick. I
Well,
love Bryan Cranston.
I mean, to me, like there was an obvious story sitting right in front of them where like, okay, Juliette Binoche dies, his wife dies, he's consumed with the research and obsession over, what was the cause of this thing. And the rest of the story should play out like, the father and the son reuniting, and Godzilla becomes this metaphor for, father and son bonding over the
Shared
loss,
grief.
their shared grief. It could be, a little bit of like a Last Crusade kind of a story with Bryan Cranston and, his son,
Well,
who's
I remember walking out of the theater in 2014 thinking, all right, the special effects were beautiful and they were expensive and that sort of thing. But I said, if you were to remove all the human characters from the story, would anything change or anything be different? The human characters are basically there just to observe what's happening. But it's like if the humans are not actually playing a role in the story in any way, shape, or form that meaningfully impacts the behavior or the actions of the monsters, once again, they just feel very disposable. When I was revisiting King of the Monsters and Godzilla versus Kong, I started cracking up because they're like major movie stars that I had forgotten were in these movies. I was like, oh my God, like I forgot she was in this, but I guess, yeah, here she is. Like Elizabeth Olsen, Scarlet Witch herself.
Does anyone remember that Elizabeth Olsen is in the 2014 Godzilla? Like,
yeah, I remember, but that's because I've been inappropriate.
I mean, you watched it just now, but like, I mean, Sally Hawkins. If you watch like her Mike Leigh movies, you say, oh, she's one of the best actresses around, and even something like the Paddington movies, she I think shines in those. But like, she's Ken Watanabe's secretary. Like,
yeah, I keep forgetting she's in it. I forget all these. I mean, yeah, I think the Legendary has really dropped the ball when it comes to scripts and giving the actor something to do. You got these amazing casts, but they're all so grave and so earnest and so overly serious. And I feel like oftentimes, especially in the first two, they squeeze all the life and fun out because they're trying to make everything seem so reverent. But most of the fun Godzilla movies or the entertaining Godzilla movies, like they have this like electricity running through them. They are alive and they're like short. They're like 75, 80 minutes long. They're not these 2.5-hour bloated monstrosities.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think like Godzilla King of the Monsters, a lot of that movie feels like an attempt to overcorrect for the criticism for the 2014 Godzilla, where it's like, we hardly see any of the action. It's obscured. So it's like, here's wall-to-wall monster action. Oh, and it's boring.
Well, you mentioned obscured action. You gave me a great clip earlier from the 2014 film, which I'm going to let it rip right now.
That's actually my favorite shot in the Gareth Edwards one.
And it allows your imagination to, oh wow, like it gives you a sense of scale. And if you allow the imagination to kind of fill in the gaps, it makes your special effects all the more potent.
And you just get that sense of grace, which you don't always get with these Monsterverse movies. That tail going over, it's so quiet. It creates a really interesting effect. I think also when people talk about some of the issues with the Gareth Edwards one, there are things I like about it. I do think there are genuinely good things about it. It's just
I mean, I've got my ticket for the next one. I'll be there on Thursday with a smile on my face, hoping for the best.
Yeah, I think people talk about, oh, can an American Godzilla film ever recapture the cultural context. You know, if these films are so specific to Japan that you can't ever have an American one that works. And I think like you do kind of feel a little bit of that in how similar the Gareth Edwards one is actually to the Roland Emmerich one, where you're like, "Ah, I guess this movie's about trying to stop some eggs from hatching." You know, like, wait, what's this movie about? Oh, I guess monster eggs, you know.
Well, one
It
thing I
doesn't
think a lot
really
of the
have
American
that
movies get
context.
wrong is that if something's of that scale and size,
Yeah,
it should almost appear to be moving in slow motion to give it a sense of scale. But if something's rolling around like a 6 foot tall Russian circus acrobat, it's like, well, then it makes it immediately feel small and it kind of
yeah,
breaks the verisimilitude. When something is 500 feet tall or more, it should have like a grandeur to its movements. But when you watch Godzilla versus Kong at the end, when they're fighting Mecha Godzilla, you know, they're rolling around and leaping into the air. I mean, it almost feels like people who are 6 feet tall. And I just think the physics
yeah.
just start to fall to pieces. And I like it when Godzilla seems like an angry god, like wrathfully striding through a city. And in Godzilla -1, what was cool is the first scene of him when he's small, he's moving
Yeah.
quickly. And it makes sense there. The bigger he gets, the slower he moves.
It's eerie when he moves slow. You know, there's a power to it, there's a kind of mystery to it, and the sense that it's this unstoppable force. I think, like, I mean, also talking about the scale, Gareth Edwards, you know, he probably, I think, has issues as a storyteller, but he's a great visual stylist for like creating a sense of scale and grandeur to a lot of his sci-fi images. I think where some of the later MonsterVerse films, like the Anna Moonguard ones, have issues with is the scale, where like Godzilla and King Kong, they're so big, but they're framed like they're the same height as us. You know, there's no sense of scale to them. It creates this kind of cartoonish effect, which I don't like. But 2 years after the Gareth Edwards
Sure, well,
Godzilla,
pause on that real
okay,
quick. I feel like we've been very selfish in terms of not
wait,
inviting anybody from the chat into the conversation so far. So
I like
hold,
Super
hold,
Gremlin
hold,
95's comment.
hold that point. First question, Funky Cold Medina, very nice, aka Matthias. Hey guys, looking forward to hearing what you have to say about Godzilla. What is your favorite obscure Godzilla film? For me, I'll pick the obvious one, Godzilla versus Hedorah, aka the Smog Monster. But that's I feel like that's kind of the basic big bitch answer. But I'm not enough of an expert not to have the basic bitch answer. So, what would be your favorite obscure Godzilla flick?
I'm not really sure what's obscure. I guess if Godzilla versus Destroyer is obscure now, maybe that one. I like Godzilla versus Destroyer a lot.
Well, Eric Patterson asks, "Hey James, how are you doing today? I'm feeling good because I got my brand new Godzilla muscle shirt, which arrived in the mail yesterday. So, yeah, at least it arrived just in time for this,
I
as
have
well as my review coming up on Thursday. I like having themed T-shirts for different topics.
I should have gotten one of
Uh,
my Godzilla shirts. I have one with that same poster on it. And when I was at the TIFF Lightbox, I was going down the escalator, and this guy who looked kind of like vaguely familiar was going up the escalator, and I was just trying to figure out like, wait, where do I know that from? Who is that? And just as it clicked, oh, it's Guillermo del Toro. He had this big smile on his face, and he goes, "Great shirt." And we pass each other by on the escalator. So Guillermo del Toro likes that Godzilla poster shirt.
Very nice. All right, we got a comment here from the Goji Shea 1991. My top 5 Showa era Godzilla flicks, not counting the original, are King Kong versus Godzilla, Mothra versus Godzilla, Invasion of Astro Monster, Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla, and Terror of Mechagodzilla.
That's a
That
good
covers
spread.
a lot of them. I mean,
Yeah.
there have been 35 live action movies, but how many Godzilla movies are there total from the Showa era? Like 14 or so?
Something like I'd have to count them all out on my fingers, but there's plenty of them. The Showa era, that's the most prolific for Godzilla movies, but yeah, you get a lot of choices, but that's a good mix. I think like the last two, Mechagodzilla and Terror of Mechagodzilla, those are really great kind of note to end the era on.
And we got a comment here from the great Fred Schaefer, pal from Twitter. Frankenstein Conquers the World is a favorite Japanese monster flick of mine. Yeah, I mean, I keep waiting for a really, really good Frankenstein movie, which, I mean, there are plenty of movies that I like where Frankenstein appears in them. But if you love the novel, yeah, I don't know if Frankenstein Conquers the World is necessarily going to scratch that itch. But Tony Stella is in the chat and he
Yes.
says, Ohrai, their biggest special effect. Yeah, I hope, am I saying that last name even at all correctly? Ohrai? How do you say Noriyoshi's last name?
I say it like that, Noriyoshi, but I could be wrong.
By his first name, but yeah, I feel like
Right.
something that's so often overlooked or missing or
I
lost.
love his like Star Wars art. Even like movies that are terrible, like King Kong Lives. His poster for that, I would frame that and put it on my wall because it's just so cool. He's so good.
Well, it just there's so many movie posters these days that are just cut and paste, just like, plug and chug. Let's take the exact same poster, but just change the floating heads in the title, and boom, we got a
Yep.
movie poster. And they're just ugly and they're disgusting. Like when you walk through the lobby at a movie theater, you should pause and be like, oh, what is that? Oh, what is that? And every once in a while, one will come through, like Late Night with the Devil, that new horror film.
Yep.
That's got some cool posters and that sort of thing. Some people recognize the value of it. And obviously, Tony Stella recognized the value. And speaking of Tony Stella, I'm going to embarrass him by including a quick clip, including his poster for Godzilla -1.
So cool.
And congratulations to Tony, because his posters over at Mondo Vision have completely sold out. You can't even buy one if you want one now. So hopefully they'll have a second run, or maybe they'll hire Tony to do some more. But if memory serves, and I probably have some of the details wrong, but Tony basically got inspired in the middle of the night and just cranked that out. And it took off and people really loved it. So I don't know if it's available in Japan, but I think it's available or was available everywhere else. But
And I've seen a lot of people ask like if that was the official poster, or like I think even I've seen people on Japan Twitter sharing it, and people love that poster. I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, 100%. All right, well, let me get one more question, and then we'll get back to what I interrupted you. A lot of comments from the Goji Shay. I love King Caesar from Mechagodzilla 74. He's one of my favorite, more obscure monsters. Yeah, King Caesar. For people who don't know who King Caesar is, I barely know who he is. I've seen one movie with him. Who is King Caesar?
He's the big dog-looking thing that comes out and fights. Actually, he kind of gets his ass kicked by Mechagodzilla. He doesn't put up the best fight, but he's the sort of dog-looking one. He's in. He shows up in Final Wars. He's like a big dog, King Caesar.
All right. Now, earlier you were about to make a comment after the 2014. You said there's like a 2-year break. So what were you about to say then?
Shin Godzilla, which I think like that really slows down Godzilla, makes him scary, makes him impactful, meaningful. Like I think Shin Godzilla, that was kind of the first official Riway Toho Godzilla film, and it was like one of the best since the first movie. I think like really it captured a lot of people's attention. And
if not for Godzilla -1, a lot of people would say that's the best Japanese Godzilla film since the original.
What's funny is like when Godzilla -1 came out, a lot of people are like, "Oh, it's like one of the best Godzilla films in years. It's one of the best Godzilla films since Shin Godzilla," which it's kind of like it's the best one since the last one. But it's true. Like they're really two of the best Godzilla films. And you have two directors. You have Hideaki Anno, who is most famous for the Neon Genesis Evangelion series. And you have Shinji Higuchi, who was the special effects director for the 90s Gamera films. And he also worked a little bit on Neon Genesis and Gunhead and some animation. So like I think together they created a really distinct vision for Shin Godzilla, which in a lot of ways feels back to basics. It's not quite a remake of the original, but it's kind of like, let's take those elements that were so effective in the original film and rework them and use them to create this new vision.
And some new ingredients. They were inspired by the style of Aaron Sorkin. And when you watch it,
it's a procedural.
The editing style is so fast and the dialogue is delivered so quickly. Like, oh my God, can I watch this at half speed just to kind of keep up with what's happening? It's so just like, just like a ping pong ball bouncing around. Well, it is fucking delightful and so energizing.
It's like some of the best scenes don't even have to do with Godzilla. It's just watching people reacting to the fallout, the response, the government's kind of slow reaction, the way the bureaucracy functions. I mean, I like some of the details, like after the prime minister gets killed, like they're like, who's next in command? And it goes to like the minister of agriculture or something. Like they just need somebody in charge. But, all these scenes of people meeting and trying to work things out and the kind of slow response to this natural disaster. I mean, you can see a lot of the influence of the Fukushima disaster in Shin Godzilla. Like, the fact that you have Godzilla changing forms and it gets like bigger and worse. It's sort of like the earthquake leading to the tsunami, which leads to
when he first appeared, I was like, oh, this is probably going to be one of the many monsters that Godzilla fights. And then I was like, no, this is like he's still taking shape.
It's also like, Godzilla is the only monster in the movie, and sometimes that's all you need. Like you don't need like I think Godzilla can be enough to be interesting,
especially when
making
you
it
let him
on his own.
actually have like a catastrophic effect on his impact. My favorite moment in the entire movie, at one point, he basically just kind of goes down into like a ball and all of his dorsal fins light up and he zaps lasers in all directions, taking out helicopters and planes. I was like, well, that's the coolest fucking thing I've seen all day. Like, more of that, please. And yeah, I was delighted by Shin Godzilla. And, some of the special effects might appear a little clunky to some people, but there's a style and an energy and a tone to it that is irresistible. And I think it's one of the best Godzilla films I've ever seen.
I love the scale of it. I think, like, compared to the Monsterverse design for Godzilla, like, I just like the design for Shin Godzilla so much more. It's so strange and terrifying. Like, I mean, people kind of forget, but like the original Godzilla in 1954 looks scary. Like, they made him look kiddyish over time in the Showa era, but like going back and watching that first one, like he's got this like charred black skin and he looks like he's in pain. And he's like, if you try to gauge the intelligence of Godzilla in like 1954 or Shin Godzilla, it's almost like it's got some kind of a fish brain, but it's the power of a god, this unstoppable force that's in pain and lashing out. And I think like that whole confluence of touches just makes it something really powerful and terrifying. And I love scenes like the Defense Force blasting it, and it just does nothing. It's impenetrable, it's unstoppable. It's a force that just can't be stopped with military power.
We got a little clip that you prepared for us. I'm going to let her rip in 3, 2, 1.
It's such a good design, right?
And the way the jaw kind of almost like a snake breaks open and stretches it like a cottonmouth. And the other clip you had, but it got shot down for some reason by YouTube. But you speak about design and atmosphere and tone. And as he opens his mouth, it's slowly opening. You're like, oh no, what's going to happen when it finishes opening? It gives you a little anticipation and dread. And I think if there were one lesson to be learned by the American equivalents, would be, let him slow down. And he's got all the time in the world, because he knows no matter what you do, it's inevitable what he's about to do to you.
And you have that incredible final shot, like after they freeze Godzilla, and you just see the tail splitting off into these like sort of humanoid monsters, and it's like they just stopped it on the cusp of becoming this like global problem. And I think that like Evangelion connection just adds this whole other flavor to Godzilla, which worked really, really well for Shin Godzilla. And I also kind of like the fact that Shin Godzilla is a one-off. It's not like they did Shin Godzilla 2 right away. They could have, because it was a big hit. And they did Shin Ultraman, which is something completely different. But I like that Toho's kind of taking.
And there's another Shin movie with like an insect
Kamen Rider, the guy on the
motorbike
with the insect face. Yeah, that's a popular series in Japan.
So when they put Shin on the front, what does that mean?
Like reborn, basically. Okay. Or renewed. So like it kind of turned into but Shin Ultraman, it's like a different kind of back to basics, and it's like back to silly basics. So it's not like it's something done in the same tone as Shin Godzilla. Like it's very silly and funny. And I think like if we're contrasting the current era to the Millennium era, one thing I kind of like is that the Millennium era, it felt a lot like we're just throwing anything at the wall and hoping something sticks. And here it feels much more deliberate, like you're throwing darts, aiming at a bullseye, and it feels like they've just got 2 bullseyes in a row between Shin Godzilla.
They're successful by design, not by accident.
Yeah. And it feels like Toho's just waiting for the right director, the right vision, the right story to kind of do a new Godzilla film. And I hope they do the same thing again. Like I would be fine if there's no Godzilla -1, 2, or I don't know, whatever. I would like it if they kind of took a step back again and said like, okay, like who else has an interesting vision that they can bring to Godzilla? So
it's hard to remember the last time where an international director made such an immediate splash with American audiences. Takashi Yamazaki, I'd never even heard his name before I saw Godzilla -1. And in a matter of weeks, he achieved superstar status. I think no matter what he does next, you can market the movie as the director of Godzilla -1, no matter what the topic is, and people will be there. But quick shout out to Bill Scurry. He's also in the chat. Bill Scurry designed the little interface today. He sent it to me as a gift ahead of time. So Martin Kessler, you have him to thank for that. But he says, what he said, Kramer versus Godzilla. Yeah, I mean, Kramer versus Kramer. I saw that once on TV when I was a kid, and I was like, this is boring. But anyway, maybe I misjudged it because I was 9 years old. Do you have any strong feelings of Kramer versus Kramer, or possibly Kramer versus Godzilla?
Kramer versus Godzilla. I think Godzilla would win.
Yeah, I think Dustin is Godzilla. Actually, I can't remember. It was Kramer or Meryl?
It's like, have you seen what's it? Godzilla versus Bambi?
Yeah, just which is exactly what I wish would happen to the majority of the characters in the American Godzilla films. Like that little girl with the little headband who's constantly going like doing that weird slow motion grin when she looks at Godzilla and Godzilla versus Kong. I'm like, please, King Kong, just step on her by accident. Like, just can we get this girl out of the cast?
Full of actors that are just kind of wasted. Like Rebecca Hall. I'm like, oh my! They got her back for another King Kong versus Godzilla. Like I'm looking at the trailer for the new one.
I was watching Godzilla versus Kong a couple of days ago. I was like, I had no memory of Rebecca Hall being even in this movie, and I like Rebecca Hall. I've liked her since Christina Barcelona.
Pays for her to go off and do like a passing or whatever she wants to do. Like that's cool. Take the paycheck. But it's just funny that you would get these high caliber actors to basically just like the old Godzilla films. You just needed like. I mean, there's some great actors in the old Godzilla films, but just the fact that you would get some of the best actors around today to just kind of stand there and deliver exposition, I guess that's kind of what Shimura did in the original, but you know what I mean? Like it feels kind of wasteful to get some of these actors and then give them nothing to do really.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure she got to buy a house or a boat with the money.
I mean, that's great. Like for her, I think that's great.
But I just noticed that Agent Black, who's a member of the channel, is in the chat, which is a reminder for me that I need to give out some memberships. So I just did a gift of 20 memberships to everybody in the chat. Take it or don't take it. It's free. So if you want to be a member of the channel, by all means, feel free to accept. But we've been going an hour at this point, and my coffee is really kicking in. Okay. Dying to take a piss. So I am going to real quick play the pee break video. And we'll be back in 2 minutes. Okay. All right, I guess Mr. Kessler's got stronger flow than I do, but we'll just kill some time with answering some questions before he gets back. Who else is in here that I've not said hello to? Oh, Charity Schmidt, hello. She says, I still need to watch Shin Godzilla. Yeah, you can thank Mr. Kessler later. I saw it because of him, and yeah, it absolutely rocks. Goji Shea says, I've also heard Shin in Japanese can also mean true. Okay, yeah, I'm totally unfamiliar with some of the translations and whatnot. It's funny, I was watching the miniseries for Shogun from 1980 a couple days ago, and there's so many great scenes there where Mariko is teaching Blackthorn how to speak Japanese because there are no subtitles in that show. And I was like, I feel like I'm learning a few phrases. Mr. Kessler, are you back
Hello.
with us? I was just killing time, tap dancing across a bunch of laser beams.
Okay, I'm back.
We
I'm
got
back.
you?
Yep.
Very cool. All right. Boom, boom, boom. Well, let's push on ahead to Godzilla King of the Monsters 2019. Basically, in a lot of ways, it's like a really serious remake of Ghidorah, the three-headed monster. We had the same four kaiju, but a very different story. And a lot of these characters reappear in Godzilla versus Kong. But now that you've had 5 years to digest Godzilla King of the Monsters, what are your most lingering impressions of this flick? Because for me, some of the monster design obviously looks expensive, looks gorgeous,
Yeah.
but I once again have a real problem with getting emotionally invested in any of the
Same.
characters.
It's a film that I wish I liked more than I did because Godzilla jumping back into the Showa era, and doing like a big budget updated version of that should be really cool. And I like, for me, some of the Monsterverse designs are kind of hit and miss. Like I think King Ghidorah looks fantastic in Godzilla King of the Monsters. Like I think
I've got
that's
it ready to rock with your clip. Well, three
Great.
heads better than one or none.
I like too how they gave each head a different personality. It's sort of it's a nice touch, I think, to update the character and give it some more life and personality.
It's like the three-headed monster in Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Like, well, you've got bad breath, and like
And
kind
I
of
think
arguing and bickering.
I looked at some of the concept art. Some of the designs look really alien in the concept art, where like two of the heads are almost like arms, or like they tried a lot of different stuff. And I like that they kind of kept with something that's really in the spirit of the original. It's just updated. I think Rodan looks great. I think like that's also very good update of the classic Showa era design. Mothra and Godzilla, though, like I've never quite liked their designs for the
I've noticed the
Monsterverse.
change, a change in the design of Godzilla for Godzilla Kong: The New Empire, because
Yep.
the most frequent complaint from King of the Monsters was his belly's too big and his head is too small, and it just
Yep.
makes him seem out of proportion. But I was looking at the trailer today, as well as some of the posters. You can tell they're changing the proportions of the design, but obviously you can't radically change because they've got this continuity with their Monsterverse.
Yeah, I'm not sure if like the intent was with the Gareth Edwards one to make the head tiny for perspective, or why they chose it. I never loved that design. Like in my opinion, the Monsterverse Godzilla should look like Godzilla minus one Godzilla. Where you just take one look at it and you're like, oh, that's Godzilla. Like
Yeah.
right away. Yeah, I'm not in love with the Godzilla design, which is kind of a problem. And I think
That's
also
the
the
most recurring
characterization of
complaint with
Godzilla,
the
like
trailer. When Godzilla King of the Monsters first dropped, when you see him in profile blasting into the sky, it's like, did he eat a bunch of donuts before y'all shot that scene? Like he just looks like he's about to burst right open.
Oh, we got a comment here. I don't blame you guys if you're choosing to look past the Godzilla anime trilogy of movies on Netflix. Yeah, those anime movies.
I saw the first one. I saw the first one on
I've seen them
Netflix,
all.
I think during COVID, and I actually did enjoy it.
I think like there are really cool ideas in it. It's hard for me to get into that anime style where it's using 3D animation to try to look like 2D anime. But like there's interesting ideas where it's much more abstract, where like
And I like how they handle
Mechagodzilla is industry, and Mechagodzilla is like a whole city instead of a monster, and Ghidorah is religion, and like it's a much more kind of abstract kind of take on the subject. So I think like I don't know if the movies are that great, but I like
There's
the
some
idea
pacing
behind
issues
them.
in the first
Yeah.
one, but there were some beautiful shots.
I love. I think there's a scene in the first one where like there's a Godzilla who gets killed, and then like there's an even bigger Godzilla that like rises out of the earth, who's been sleeping for a million years or something like that. I'm like, oh, that's kind of cool. But just the art style, I think, was kind of the big hurdle for me to get into those. I couldn't really get on board with them.
Well, I'm seeing a comment here from the great John Cribbs from the Pink Smoke. He seems to agree with our complaints about Godzilla moving a little bit too dexterously and a little bit too agilely, if that's even a word, in the recent crop of flicks. Yeah, the wrathful God looking down on us, passing judgment. That is the version that I prefer. But Godzilla clearly as a character can lend itself to a wide variety of styles and interpretations. The fact that Godzilla minus one can be popular, but at the same time that a lot of people like Legendary shows how people are open to different interpretations, and you can pick and choose from the buffet which interpretations are most pleasing to you. I mean, once again, we have 38 movies, including the animated movies. That's insane. Like James Bond's got a little over 20. Marvel's got close to 30, I think. It blows my mind that this thing's been going now. King Kong for 90 years, Godzilla for 70 years. They stand alone in that respect.
Yeah. I think like talking about the characterization of Godzilla, there's times where it's great for him to be a terrifying god of pain and destruction, all of that. And there's times where it's great for Godzilla to be the defender of Earth and the hero. And I think like even less seriously than that, like there's times where it's great for Godzilla to just be like a wrestling heel, like in King Kong versus Godzilla, the original one. You know, he's just a wrestling heel. That's all he is. But I think like part of my problem with the characterization of Godzilla in the Monsterverse films is they kind of try to split the difference for a lot of that, where he's like, you know, the powerful god. He's also the defender of Earth. He's also kind of just like an asshole sometimes. Like, I'm not quite sure that they hit on a single idea of like what Godzilla represents in those movies, character-wise. Which
I mean,
know it's a
clearly
little
now they want it to be Lethal Weapon. When you see Godzilla and King Kong running side by side in battle, oh, okay, it's Mel Gibson and Danny
which,
Glover.
I mean,
fighting Mr. Joshua.
which sounds on some level kind of awesome if you're going to do Lethal Weapon with King Kong and Godzilla. But just looking at that trailer, I don't know if I'm gonna like that movie.
I hope. Here's my sincere hope, because if I'm paying to see a movie, I want every movie that I'm paying to see to be good, even if if I'm skeptical. But I'm hoping that the director learned a few lessons from the first film, not from the things that he thinks he did well, but from the things he did less well, and that it'll be just as weird and deranged as some of the Godzilla films that he likes. Because I watched an interview between him and the director of Godzilla -1, and they're going back and forth about what they like and dislike. And the movies that he likes are Godzilla versus Destroya, Godzilla versus the Smog Monster, and Godzilla -1. Like, those are the ones that he enjoys. What lessons will he learn, and what will he choose to include in this latest film? But for me, it just looks like an exec at a table said, look, Thanos was popular. We need an Infinity Gauntlet, and we want, but also Transformers are popular, so make it kind of look like Transformers. Oh, and buddy films used to be popular. Maybe a buddy. I mean, it all felt like, I don't know, very calculated and artificial.
I think like if we're talking about what separates the silliness of the Showa era Godzilla movies with some of the silliness today, and like why I might like King Kong versus Godzilla more than Godzilla versus Kong, like I think some of these Monsterverse movies, when they're being silly, they lack some of that charm. Even though like the old films, they didn't have big budgets or anything like that, there was a charm and a childlike imagination to them that I feel like some of these newer ones don't quite capture. I think maybe that's also part of my issue with Godzilla King of the Monsters, is because, you know, like clearly they wanted to make that one more for kids than the Gareth Edwards one. You put in the kid from Stranger Things, you try to make it a little bit more kid oriented, and it's like,
and you have her team up with a stupid. Actually, no, she didn't team up with the podcaster until Godzilla versus Kong. Yeah, you have this stupid divorced parent nonsense.
Yeah, that's Kramer versus Godzilla.
Yeah, that's Kramer versus Godzilla. And you have Coach Taylor from Friday Night Lights in there. And Coach Taylor, it's like, he's great as a high school football coach. I don't need him in Godzilla movies. And he's even more worthless when he's the way he's employed in Godzilla versus Kong, where periodically he gets on the phone with his daughter. He's like, remember me? I'm still in the movie. I need to express concern about where she might be.
I mean, what's funny to me is that Kyle Chandler, he's
Coach Taylor, Dylan Panthers.
Well, the thing I thought of him first is the Peter Jackson King Kong. He's the like self-absorbed movie star. So it's kind of cool that he was in like 2 different King Kong iterations. But in King Kong versus Godzilla, he's basically just on the phone to be like, "Hey, I'm here for my paycheck." He's literally phoning it in, I think, in that movie.
And that artificial term, she's trying to sell it. He's trying to sell it. She's like, "Dad, where are you?" And like, "I'm losing my cell phone signal." It's like, it's the most artificial, strained melodrama, and I want all the characters just to get stepped on. But her little team of investigators, and they're trying to like hack into Mechagodzilla. I mean, that whole trio. I got no use for him.
And well, I think like the human characters kind of make or break these movies. Like Shin Godzilla has, I'm not sure every character. The one character I kind of have an issue with in Shin Godzilla, which is pretty close to a perfect movie, is the
Japanese American.
The Japanese American, yeah, exactly. She's the senator's daughter who's going to be president someday.
Yeah,
where it's just, I don't know how much of it's the performance and how much of it's how the character's written, but it's like, oh, you know, for a film that's like pretty standout on all levels. But like Godzilla -1, I think like what really makes that film work is the human story and the
Oh yeah,
humanity
you're in
behind
love
that.
with
And
not only
yeah,
the hero, but you're in love with multiple characters. Like, oh my God, I want more of that character. I want more of that character. And I think it was really like a light bulb going off in a lot of people's heads. Like, oh, I didn't even know you could get invested emotionally in the characters in a Godzilla movie. But Godzilla Minus One, that movie, I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but it almost feels like a movie that's trying to have like a resurrection or redemption arc for the soul of Japan moving on from World War II. I mean,
yeah.
I just couldn't believe how emotionally stirring it was and how I was like moved to tears by the movie, which I did not anticipate.
No, it's like I said, it was my favorite movie that came out last year. I put it at #1 on my list because it really is that moving and that good. You know, it's not just giant monsters stomping stuff. Like there's a really engaging story, and you almost feel like as this post-war Japanese putting your life back together story, it would even work without a Godzilla. Like it's that good how well-rounded it is and how moving the story is. I think
All
like
right. Well, I'm going to get
Takashi
totally sidetracked with
Yamazaki.
minus one. So let's try to put
All right, all
to
right.
bed King
Let's
of the
finish
Monsters and
the
Godzilla v Kong.
yeah.
Play devil's advocate for me.
Okay.
Persuade me, convince me. What are the best ingredients from the recent crop of legendary movies? Why are these? Because these movies are popular. They're doing well. They would not keep making them out of charity. They're
No,
popular.
I think one of the best things these movies have going for them is just a throwback to the Showa era monster mash, anything goes kind of philosophy. I think like that's where some of the most fun is in King of the Monsters. Like when you have I mean, one of my favorite moments is when you have somebody like blast out of their ejector seat in the plane and just immediately get eaten by
Swallowed.
Rodan.
Yeah.
I think like
I like that bit. Yeah.
there are moments where I'm like, if the movie was just peppered with this, it would be a blast. And there are like moments in Godzilla versus Kong where I'm like, I do get a little bit of that like childhood wow factor when you just see Kong's giant fist while they're on top of an aircraft carrier smashing into Godzilla's stupid little head. I'm like, this is
I've got the clip
honestly pretty
ready
cool.
to go. Here we go.
I think there's
It is.
that obviously you're limited by when you were still doing it all with people in suits. So I think like they should probably lean into that more. And I don't know, who knows? Maybe Godzilla X Kong will pull that off. But
All right. And then I'm old and out of touch on most topics. What is this new trend of putting X into titles? Because it's not just Godzilla, Kong, the New Empire. There's like this new thing where it's like, oh no, the X is silent. I'm like, so explain to a tired old
Godzilla
man
time
who would rather be playing video games and watching
You're
porn.
asking somebody who's almost as old and certainly is out of touch. So I'm not sure what to tell you. I thought like, it's like when people put
How
their
did the trend
names
get
carved
started?
into
What
a
was the
tree.
first one?
I don't know. Like I've seen like, like Joey X Sally and stuff like that carved into things. I don't know. Or graffiti. I
Yeah,
don't know where
all I
it
know is
came
that
from.
I've
I
heard
don't
the
know when
director
it's
describing the movie in interviews, and he just describes it as Godzilla Kong. I'm like, all right, so we're supposed to call it Godzilla Kong, but then it's like, it's just going to be. I think it's distracting as opposed to
actually it's
amplifying the
Godzilla hyphen
experience.
Kong. I kept my maiden name. No, I,
Or Godzilla slash Kong. I mean, I don't know, but I thought
yeah,
Godzilla Minus One was a cool title, and it actually provoked a little conversation. Like, what does Godzilla Minus One actually mean? But Godzilla X Silent X Kong, the New Empire, just feels like a
I feel like
mouthful.
if you're going by the old like Showa philosophy, it would be like what's the villain called? That like orangutan looking monster.
Ooh, wait, the only orangutan I'm aware of is either King Kong or Baby Godzilla.
Oh well, there's like an evil giant ape in the trailer for Godzilla X Kong. It
Oh,
should be
it's
like
somehow. Sorry, I got confused about which movie we were talking about first. Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
basically, but I feel like having a whole shitload of people the size and race of King Kong diminishes how unique King Kong is, and so I think that's a critical mistake. But I haven't seen it, so who knows? Maybe
But
I'll be.
it should be like King Kong versus whoever Scar King featuring Godzilla. It should be something like that. But I think like also something I wish that they leaned into more with the CGI is like doing things that you couldn't do with people in suits. Like I mean, one reason why King Kong got scaled up for the original King Kong versus Godzilla is like, hey, it's people in suits; they have to be the same size.
Yeah.
But like, because
King
King
Kong's
Kong,
like 40 feet tall in
yeah,
the
he
first
was
movie.
he was tiny in I mean, relative to Godzilla, he's tiny by human standards. He's large, but like, I think it would have been cool seeing a Godzilla versus Kong, where like Godzilla's 5 times bigger than Kong, and he has to use his wits and things. Like they made him so big, like to me, it became comical when he's like hanging off a skyscraper and the whole thing's tilting over him. Like he used to climb up the Empire State Building and be a little dot.
Yeah, like they're so big now that if they were to jump, they might threaten to like push the Earth out of its natural rotation. Like it just the scale has gotten tremendous. So I feel like the next stage would just be take them off planet, let them go into space. I never saw the Space Godzilla one, but it has a glorious poster. Is there room for this franchise to go out into space?
Yeah, sure. I think usually like space comes to Earth in these movies, but they could go off to another planet.
'Cause that's what I love most about Ghidorah, the idea that he is not part of our ecosystem. He
Yeah.
comes from a planet where he already destroyed the entire planet. And I love how even in the silly 60s movies, they still sell you on the idea one-on-one, he's going to beat the fuck out of Godzilla. Godzilla needs Mothra, and he also needs Rodan and at least in the three-headed monster, or otherwise he can't hang.
I mean, that could be their, the Monsterverse, their Avengers. I guess that's kind of what they tried to. They sort of rushed it with the Godzilla King of the Monsters, where it's like Mothra and Godzilla teaming up against King.
No, they put their universe before their story.
Yeah, yeah.
And if you try to rush your universe, they thought that, because we had all those murals and cave drawings or whatnot in Kong Skull Island, everybody just accepts the idea that all these characters are in here now. But if they had taken their time, they would have introduced all the monsters in separate monster movies and then had the team up. And then Godzilla King of the Monsters would have been like Avengers Infinity War.
I like Tony Stella's comment. He says, I hope he gets an eye patch. Just picturing King Kong with a robot arm and an eye patch.
Yeah, I mean, at least it would be a wink to the audience. We know this is ridiculous. We're not taking it, but so seriously.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, the Monsterverse films, clearly, I don't love them. No shade to people if you do love them. Like, I think that's fine. That's one of the cool things about this era is like that's not the only Godzilla that we're getting. So
yeah,
like,
they're harmless. I think they're harmlessly inoffensive. There are certain shows and movies that are so horrible. I'm like, oh, everybody who involved needs to be like slow boiled and just like send me like an audio file of their screams so I can listen to them as I go to sleep. Like where you just develop like deep feelings of hatred for the people behind these movies and shows. But with these, with the legend, I mean, Legendary in general. They did the friggin' Dark Knight trilogy with Christopher Nolan. Like Legendary is at least trying to do things like Dune Part 2. I think Legendary, as far as like big giant studios are concerned, they're actually one of the better players out there. But who knows? I hope they can at least give us one really good Godzilla movie before they get to playing with this toy.
I don't know. I don't know if we're gonna get that. I mean, again, like I love Kong Skull Island, and I kind of wish that. If you're going to do Showa era silliness, like you captured a little bit more of that tone where, it can be child friendly, but you can also have like just weird, unexpected violence. You could have, like I was just watching one of the Gamera movies, I think Gamera versus Giron, where he goes to the other planet and he fights the monster with like a knife for a head. And that monster, it's a little kid's movie, but he chops up the bird Gauss and he's saying he's stinky and like there's like crazy violence in this kids film. I think people sort of forget that like kids like weird dark things, otherwise Godzilla never would have been popular with kids in the first place.
Yeah,
So
I mean, what I learned a long time ago is that anytime people try to soften children's entertainment, it's only because the parents are complaining that, oh, my child's having bad dreams and they're keeping me up at night, so I'm not getting to work on time. So it's an inconvenience to me. Can you please soften the movie? Every kid that I knew from like age 5 to 10 wanted to see the crazy shit. And it's like, like, I've never seen a child say, oh, no, this movie's too violent for me. Oh, no, this movie's too disturbing for me. They're like, whoa, I didn't know movies could be like this. Like most kids eat that shit up.
So to go from Kong Skull Island, where there's like references to cannibal Holocaust with people being impaled by these like giant walking spider creatures, to
or Apocalypse Now,
Apocalypse Now, like skull crawlers spitting up skulls, and like having also this like very kind of colorful and fun tone. I think to go from that to
and Tom Hiddleston and Brie Larson just seems so game.
Oh, they're like they're well, to me, who really makes Kong Skull Island, it's John C. Reilly and Samuel L. Jackson. I think those two are really the characters that make that movie work, where you have John C. Reilly kind of being the heart of the film and this soldier who's been stranded for years on this island who wants to get back home, and Samuel L. Jackson, who's like the Captain Ahab who's going to go and take down King Kong no matter what. And you know, those characters are actually, I think, really good. But you know, to go from that to Godzilla versus Kong, where it's like very kidified in a safe way, I think feels like a big step down. So that was one of my problems with Godzilla versus Kong. It's also crazy to me, like just the age of these cinematic icons. Like if you're talking about Godzilla, he's 70 years old. King Kong's 90 years old. And you know,
yeah, King Kong's older than Superman. He's older than Batman.
He's older than Batman. Yeah. You know, the fact that you can put a 90-year-old character in a movie during a pandemic and people show up and watch, you know, King Kong fighting Mechagodzilla and ripping his head off. You know, like it's amazing to me that these characters can be that old and still put butts in seats. I think like that fact I find really interesting. And I mean, last year I wrote this big long piece about King Kong for Film 99 because I thought, hey, it was the 90th anniversary. It's going to be the year of King Kong, but it turned out like...
If people look at the video description, they'll see Kong Jubilee by Kessler. I've got it linked in the video description.
But I think really it turned out to be the year of Godzilla. You know, I think like, especially if you look at Godzilla -1, the release of that, the success it's had, the popularity it's had, I'm like, oh, like it's Godzilla's year. It's not King Kong's year. So yeah. I think, you know, like you said at the very beginning, if this is the best era for Godzilla, I kind of think it is. You know, between Shin Godzilla, Godzilla -1, and if you like the Monsterverse stuff, you know, that's there for you to enjoy too. So, you know, I feel like we're getting kind of the best of both worlds if you're into silly stuff, or if you're into hard-hitting, more serious Godzilla. I think, you know, you get both options. Oh, somebody lost power. Oh, can people in the comments still hear me? I'm still here. I don't know if anyone's got questions in the chat. I can talk with you guys while James comes back. He just messaged me. He'll be back in a moment. So gonna look through some of the comments and see if I can find anything to respond to. Fun fact about the Godzilla Power Hour, Hanna-Barbera for some reason wasn't allowed to use the traditional Godzilla roar. So it was Ted Cassidy voicing Godzilla, making all his roars. That Godzilla roar, it's so iconic. I love, if anybody's read Godzilla, the Half-Century War, the comic book series, just how it's illustrated, the roar, where you see it almost like a waveform. You can kind of see the shape of it, and you know right away how it sounds. It's that recognizable. Talking about Godzilla animated series, I guess there's the older one with Godzuki, which I never watched, but I did like the animated series that came out of the Roland Emmerich Godzilla. I think that was one of the best things to come out of the Roland Emmerich Godzilla. They had the animated series. I think it's the same studio that did the Men in Black animated series. It actually has a pretty cool style to it. It had this sort of Monster of the Week format. I think there's one episode where they bring back the original Godzilla as a Mechagodzilla.
Kessler, did you keep us alive while I was gone? I just lost my internet. Right. I have no internet right now. I've actually had to turn on my phone and create a personal hotspot. I have no idea how the connectivity is. Am I herky jerky and staticky, or can you hear me?
You sound good to me. Maybe we should wrap it up soon, though.
Oh, because you have a party you're going to throw. All right. So as a way of wrapping things up, we've all seen the 6-minute video now of Godzilla -1 and how they achieved the special effects.
Yeah.
And I think it's got a lot of great takeaways. If you were to zero in on 1 or 2 takeaways from that video and how they were able to keep that budget down to such a small budget. I've heard 11 million, I've heard 15 million, but small budget. Awesome result.
There's like some clip where they asked the director if how he did it all with 15 million. He's like, I wish I had 15 million.
Yeah. So
But
what did you learn from that video? Because as I was watching, I was like, I feel like a 20-year-old like film freak falling in love with movies for the
I
first
can't
time.
remember the last time I watched a video about digital effects that got me excited again. It reminds me of like when you watch the old special features for Jurassic Park and Terminator 2, and you're like, wow, like I can't believe this is possible, and it feels sort of achievable. Because famously, they only had a crew of, I think, 35 digital effects artists, which is tiny compared to the average big Hollywood film, which has like sometimes thousands of digital artists working for them. But basically, they cut down on bureaucracy. Like they said, there was no visual effects director. They just reported directly to Yamazaki.
Yeah, I love
The
that
director
the
was the
paper.
visual effects
They
director.
bring the paper together. It's like
Yeah.
in betweens, like artists and director. Let's just let them talk to each other directly.
So the distance between 2 points is not a straight line; it's zero.
Yeah.
But he's somebody who has an animation background. Like he's also worked a lot in 3D animation. I haven't seen everything he's done, but he did the 3D animated Lupin the Third movie, which I thought I was going to hate. This is like before he did Godzilla or anything like that, and surprisingly, it won me over. I'm like, oh, this is actually pretty good. And compared to like the 3D animated Studio Ghibli movie that came out around that same time with The Little Witch, I'm like, oh, this is so much better. And I think in Japanese animation, it's common for the director to do the storyboards, and you kind of have to have a clear visual.
Yeah, and if you can't draw
approach.
storyboards, maybe you're not a filmmaker.
Yeah. So like that's common in Japanese animation. Like basically, if you're the director, you need to storyboard the film. Like that's your vision you're putting out there. So I think he has that animation background. He's also worked with live action films that show the wartime period. Godzilla -1, it's like the very end of the war, but like one of the films I'd seen by him was The War of Archimedes, which is about the building of the Yamato, like the biggest battleship ever, which is a really fantastic film, actually. Like that's kind of what put him on my radar before he did Godzilla. But he's got a really strong background. For talking about him like he's an overnight success, it's like an overnight success that's been years and years in the making.
Yeah.
So he's obviously a very talented filmmaker with a lot of experience. And I think the crew, what they said basically is like, hey, we didn't have like a ton of resources and a ton of time, but work smarter instead of work harder, I think was kind of their philosophy. Where they
what I've heard on a lot of the big Marvel movies, the problem is getting last minute requests from execs who have no idea how long it takes to create these effects. And so it's like, of course the effects are going to look terrible because you're constantly rewriting the movie and redoing it. But if we know in advance, like Dune Part 2, the effects look great because they had a lot of lead time, and Denis Villeneuve knew what he wanted. So he wasn't constantly changing his mind. Oh no, by the way, like we're going to add a new character. We're going to rewrite the entire movie, blah, blah,
we're gonna
blah.
change the costume. We're going to change the climax of the movie. Like
but I feel like a lot of Hollywood movies now, they're like, it's like a big bloated animal that's covered in ticks and parasites that are feeding off it. It's like go through the budget and eliminate all these bullshit positions.
Aren't even relevant to the process that determines how the action scenes look, how the visual effects look. Like they're cut out of that decision-making process altogether. So you can feel that when you watch some Hollywood films, and it's like, oh, this action scene, this special effects scene, it has no direction. And it's like, yeah, because it was pre-visualized before the director showed up, and it was focus grouped to hell after the director left to, direct whatever Taika Waititi was doing next. Like you can feel that when you watch some of these movies, that there's like a lack of direction in them.
Or if you're producing one of these big movies, instead of constantly inventing new positions and hiring new people, maybe instead just give more responsibility to the people you already have. Like, we're not giving you a raise, but we're giving you a raise entitled. You've got more responsibility now.
Yep.
We're not going to get any more money, but that's easier than hiring just this big, giant, bloated workforce. We can tell everybody's like, oh my God, like how long can I like squeeze money out of this thing?
Yeah. So I think hopefully Hollywood takes the right lessons from Godzilla -1, doing incredible visual effects with such a small team, where they had clear vision, an appropriate amount of time to do it in. And, it's like saying, well, we knew exactly what to work towards. We had this much time. We knew exactly what we had to do to get there. We had this many visual effects shots. We knew what they were going to look like because the director had it all planned out, and we stuck to that plan. And I've seen some people assume like, oh, how did the movie get these incredible visual effects on such a small budget? Well, they must have overworked everybody. And crunched the whole way, and it doesn't really seem like that from what the visual effects artists are saying. It sounds like, yeah, you know, we didn't have a ton of time or ton of resources, but we knew what we had to do, and we sort of paced ourselves. And
Yeah, and like we
we could
only
have
needed
yeah,
this 10-foot stretch of the ship, so we didn't build the whole ship. We just reused this one little like guardrail over and over and over again, or the scene where the
yeah,
roof of the building's collapsing, people are sliding down. Like it's amazing. They knew exactly how much real set they needed versus digital set, and I thought it was just a master class in economical filmmaking, delivering an incredibly emotionally powerful and very entertaining experience. And I think the entire Western film industry has so much to learn from their example.
I see. There's a question from Tony Stella. He says, we haven't even scratched the surface of Japanese pop cultural galaxies. As Hollywood fails, I hope we see a giant revival of Japanese cinema culture. What do you want to see the most? I mean, I feel like, I don't know. Like
Yoshiaki Kawajiri, clone him in a bottle and give him, and just turn him loose for like 50 more years of Yoshiaki Kawajiri
last
movies.
year, like we had Hayao Miyazaki having some of the best success of his whole career with Boy and the Heron.
Yeah.
And we had a Godzilla film that achieved like some of the biggest success of a Toho Godzilla film ever. Like I think the lesson is maybe, you know, Japan should stick to what was successful in the past. Look at the traditional 2D animation, look at the monster films, the pop culture that was successful in the past, and reinvest in it, bring in new artists who are talented, who have a vision to continue that instead of letting it kind of wither away and disappear, because obviously it can still strike a nerve, hit a
Also,
chord.
they're
make a buck.
unafraid to create new franchises.
Yeah.
I recently got up to speed on Demon Slayer because I kept hearing the most successful animated movie ever to come out of Japan is Demon Slayer. I was like, what the fuck is Demon Slayer?
Right.
The manga didn't get started in 2016. I think the movies or the show got started in 2019. And they're just slowly but surely working their way through all the books, and they're getting pretty close to the conclusion now. And it's delightful. It's wildly entertaining. Kids like it. Adults like it. It's like there's nothing wrong with building new franchises, whether you're an American studio or a Japanese studio, whatever the case might be. And I feel like I love that proving ground. The manga worked. All right, let's try the anime. Oh, the anime worked. Let's try live action. Oh, the live action worked. Well, shit, let's just start the whole process. Let's just keep it going. Make a video game. Like they know how to ease into a franchise and then build upon it when something works.
Tony Stella says, Shin Kinnikuman. It's the guy with all the muscles, right? With the
I don't know.
That'd be pretty, you know what I wouldn't mind seeing is like
starring Moose Madsen.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, Moose Madsen was supposed to be our surprise guest today, but Moose had a work conflict. But we'll get Moose on at another time.
He was gonna show off his action figures, and we would have had like a little action figure battle maybe. But
what I would love is to get you and Moose side by side on the screen, where he's got a monster in his screen and you've got a monster, and y'all can kind of fight in the middle and do the dialogue.
Okay. But you know, I wouldn't mind seeing a Shin Daimajin. I know Arrow Video released that trilogy with the giant stone statue god that comes to life and just like punishes all these wicked people. Because I don't think that's ever been revived, and those movies are really cool. And they also have music by Akira Ifukube, and those movies are fantastic.
I mean, you could do Shin Golgo 13, you could do Shin Vampire Hunter D, you could do Shin for a million. Or what I love about Japanese animation and manga is there's overflowing with so many new stories, new forms of horror, new forms of action, new forms of samurai. I mean, Ninja Scroll, when it came out 30 years ago, was like, all right, let's take everything is cool but the lone wandering samurai story and add demons to it. And it's just one of the coolest things that I've ever seen. And so, yeah, when on Oscar night, when there are only like 17 awards that get handed out, when 2 of them went to Japanese filmmakers, it's like, this is something different's going on. There's a new appetite.
Yeah.
And I feel like now, and this happened in December, there were 2 Japanese films in the U.S. domestic top 10, actually in the top 5 at the same time. That had never happened before.
I wondered if some of that had to do with the strikes in Hollywood, where that created a gap that you could fill with these.
Their loss is Japan's gain.
Yeah. But really, like, I mean, Godzilla -1, it's so good. Like, it deserves that recognition and that success. And you don't always see Japanese films get that these days. Like, you know, or if they do, it's usually not for something that's pop entertainment. It's usually for like a, you know, a movie about shoplifting children who are uplifting, or, you know, not that those films aren't good, but like, you know, it's
like art house.
It's surprising to see that kind of recognition for a Godzilla movie, but again, it really is that good. And I wish there were more clips available of it to show, but I think they've been really smart about not dumping it onto streaming right away.
They're
And
building up
especially
demand.
now it's got the
They know they have
Oscar-
something special, and
Yeah.
they want people chomping at the
Well,
bit
this
and
is how it used to be. Where
salivating.
the movie would come out, and it would be great. You'd have a great time. It would leave theaters, and then you'd spend like months anticipating the home video release.
Yeah.
And you know that used to create a lot of appetite. Now it's like some of these movies, it's in theaters, and then like a couple weeks later, it's on streaming, and it's like,
Yeah.
why even go and see it in the theater? So I think they've
Yeah,
been
like
smart
Tarantino
about,
with Jackie Brown made people wait like 4 years for the DVD. Like he's
Oh,
I
that's
want
right.
people to wait. He's like, I want people to be excited when it comes out, and it worked.
I guess
Yeah,
you know
a
that's
little
one approach.
anticipation goes a long way.
Hopefully, it doesn't take 4 years for Godzilla -1 to come out on Blu-ray, but you know,
Well,
so, I
fingers
mean, some of the
crossed, the
shots in it
Godzilla
are-
-1 Blu-ray will feature art by Tony Stella. Who knows?
I
Maybe there's
buy
a
that.
secret conspiracy behind the scenes to make that happen. But I know you got to go. I know you're throwing some huge, Roman orgy at your place tonight. Where can people find you online if they want to talk more about Godzilla? And what, just lay it on me. What are you working on, and where can people find you?
Yeah, best place to find me is on Twitter, or I guess X now it's called, at Movie Kessler.
Triple X.
Triple X. The missed opportunity, I tell you. But yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Movie Kessler. Also, I've got the King Kong articles on Film 89. So if you enjoyed anything I said here, you might want to check those out. It's like a systematic deep dive through King Kong history, and I spend a lot of it talking about Godzilla too, because you can't really talk about King Kong's history without talking about Godzilla and how they kind of influence each other over the years. Yeah, I guess that's it for now. But
thank you so
for
much for
having me
joining
on.
me.
This was
Thank you so
great.
much
No
for
interruptions this time on my end. Anyway,
yeah, they're all on me. Thank you so much for basically keeping the live stream alive while I was desperately trying. I still haven't got my internet back. Yeah, today there'd been a flood warning in New York, and so anyway, thanks to my hotspot, I was able to hop back in. But I can't thank you enough for joining me. Can't wait for whatever our next topic might be. Thank you to everybody from
in the stream. Yeah.
the Wrong Reel community, Fred and Tony
great
and
seeing everybody.
Cribs and so on and so forth. Great seeing everybody. And I'll try not to make it be so long between this live stream and the next one. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards. Oh, I got to remember to play the outro. I always forget to play the outro. Here we go.